On spending some time thinking, I've come to realize that when we as supervisors ask a student for a research question, we actually mean, what is it that you want to study and how are you going to study it? And the actual research question is a very small part of it. So I've decided to talk about a capsule of work called Conceptualizing Your Research, which covers that time after you have found your research focus and developed your research idea, and before you begin preparing your protocol and gathering your data. It includes articulating your research problem, the purpose of your research, the research questions, and how they might be related to your hypotheses and your aims and objectives. The PhD trajectory is presented as a linear process that starts with you deciding to do a PhD and ends with graduation. It comes to many students as a shock when they realize that this was merely a pragmatic representation of the process by postgraduate supervisors and administrators. What really happens is that you soon discover that doing a PhD is in reality an intellectual exercise that leads to the growth and transformation of your thought processes while solving a real problem for society. You are thrown into a process of thinking and rethinking and reorganizing your thinking until you are at a point where you can articulate what the research problem is that you would like to solve. Your research idea is not something you can write about in a single aha moment before reading, thinking about what you've read, and debating these thoughts with your colleagues and supervisor. It's an iterative process that evolves, but you cannot let it evolve forever. If you want to make progress, you need to stop and write down what you are thinking. It's that point in time that is the topic of this talk. Up to the time when you feel confident about articulating exactly what you want to do in your study, you may find that the task is chaotic and challenging. In fact, you may find that your thinking becomes more disordered as you immerse yourself in the literature and talk to others in the area. You may get distracted as even slightly related things pique your interest, and you may feel spoiled for choice about which problems you want to get involved with. As you begin thinking about doing a research project, it is all too easy to see too much of the bigger picture and put yourself off your research before you even start. The old adage of not being able to see the trees for the forest is never truer than when you first start on your first research project. The initial period involves feeding your thought processes with material to think about in its own context, in your context, and to mull over and cogitate about. You need to familiarize yourself with the bigger picture of your research idea in order to be able to hone in on the important research problems that you will invest time in for your study. It's a time that should be spent reading and reading and reading some more. In fact, it is probably best to organize your reading process by carrying out a literature review with a method to it, such as with scoping reviews, so that you are able to bring more focus to your work. To curb your distress, you need to start to develop a concise research statement. And then there is the supervisor who will be trying to get his or her head around what you want to do and will ask you questions that in the beginning you will find very difficult to answer. Science methods have a language and a process that helps you to understand and articulate what you need to do before you even try and get other people to understand what you want to do. Your research idea has a character that needs to develop from defining your problem, purpose, research questions or hypotheses to the aims and objectives. Your problem statement and your purpose statements have parts to them that give your idea the gravitas required to make sure that your research is worth doing for your sake, for the sake of the research participants, as well as a society who should benefit from your research. And you need to be confident with all of these before you write your study protocol. And then you feel overwhelmed and develop imposter syndrome and feel like it's all too much. Just like most people who have embarked upon a PhD and who have done it properly. It's okay to feel overwhelmed because the hidden curriculum is there and there's no PhD guide for dummies because every PhD is different. However, I hope to be able to provide you with a good framework that will help you to articulate your research so that the progress of your study from protocol to completion will be achievable. In this presentation, we will look at the pieces of the puzzle that will help you to get your ducks in a row and discover for yourself exactly what you want to do and enable you to articulate it to your supervisor, funder, ethics committee, or examiner. There are many ways that the elements required to articulate your research question are presented in textbooks and guides to research. There have been different interpretations associated with various disciplines which have their norms and traditions. I have, however, found that the method presented by Sharon Merriam in her 2009 book on Qualitative Methods very useful. It's a method that is easily adapted to other research methods and is very useful to us in clinical science. It's a way that will help researchers define the golden thread to their project. Merriam suggests a single-page text on which one will write a problem statement, a purpose statement, and the research questions, the PPS&Q. In developing the PPS&Q, the researcher can clarify their thinking about the project and focus it. It will show how the hypotheses and the aims and objectives will flow from this PPS&Q later. As the Seelbardenoor stated, research is always conceptualized around a problem, because otherwise there would be no reason to do research. A problem statement consists of a few sentences only. It is a concise but detailed statement that affirms what you want to learn by doing your research. If you are unable to do this in only a few sentences, that's 2 or 3 maximum, you are still thinking at the broad topic level. You are now going to define your topic as a focused research problem statement. It also convinces your audience of the need for the research to be undertaken. The research statement is the point of departure for the rest of your research project, and as such requires a lot of thought. Developing a good research problem statement is like taming a lion when it is a cub rather than waiting for it to become the head of a pride. There must be a logic to it, with all the points building up to make sense of your research. A few things that a problem statement should indicate are the background to the problem, the knowledge gap, and the context. And of course, we'll get to a conceptual framework if that is appropriate. Let us have a look at our own statement, problem statement that we can create. Peripheral arterial disease is common in patients with diabetes. Screening methods are time-consuming and operator-dependent. We have now shown a background to the problem. With the volume of patients attending the diabetes clinic, identifying PAD with the help of a biomarker will be an advantage. There we have provided a context. Beta-2 microglobulin has been identified as a possible marker and needs further investigation in our patient population who have varying degrees of renal function. There we have addressed the knowledge gap. Let us now have a look at the purpose. So moving your logic on from the problem statement, you need to close the knowledge gap by stating the purpose of your research. This statement frames and guides the study and hints at what methods you will be potentially using. It's always good to start your purpose statement with the phrase, "The purpose of this research is to." So for our example, our purpose statement could be, The purpose of this study is to determine the diagnostic accuracy of B2M in detecting PAD in patients who have diabetes and renal function impairment. The research question leads from the purpose statement and will determine the scope of the study. The way they are phrased may indicate to you what research method to follow for each question. Often the research questions can determine the different journal articles and as such can define the central chapters of a thesis by publication. Research questions are phrased as questions. They need to have a question mark at the end. For example, how diagnostically accurate is B2M in detecting PAD in patients with diabetes and varying degrees of renal function? So where does the hypothesis fit in? If a research question is answered with a descriptive study, it stays as a research question. However, if the research problem is answered by an analytical study, it is converted to a hypothesis so that the hypothesis testing can be used in a statistical analysis. At the point where you have your problem statement, your purpose statement, and your research questions, you need to be smart and refine them. So let's have a look at what it is to be smart. First of all, you have to be very specific in your research question. You have to define what you will be measuring, and your research has to be achievable. Has it got its limits? Is your research going to be relevant? Is your research testable, or the T could stand for the time that you have to allocate for it? Do you have the time? Then we go ahead and we refine that. We look at, is your research remarkable? i.e., is it going to close a knowledge gap? Is it ethical? Is it feasible? Is it interesting? Is it novel? And is it your own estimation? Is it unbiased? Once you and your co-investigators or supervisors are content that you have the right research questions that will solve your research problems, then you can develop aims and objectives. These are terms that in normal everyday language have similar meanings and cause much confusion when used in research design. Aims are what you ultimately hope to achieve in your research project. The aim is a single overall statement that emphasizes what you intend to accomplish, but not how you are going to go about doing so. There is often a single broad aim and other supporting secondary aims. The primary aim can be divided into secondary aims. There should be no more than 5 secondary aims to a primary aim. Objectives are actions you need to do in order to achieve your aims. Objectives are a list of brief statements describing what you will do in order to meet the aim of the study. They are a list of numbered, focused statements that show the recipe you are going to follow to get your anticipated research result. For example, if our aim is to investigate the diagnostic accuracy of beta-2 microglobulin to detect peripheral arterial disease in patients with diabetes mellitus and varying degrees of renal function, then our objectives would be to establish a diagnostic characteristic of B2M to detect peripheral arterial disease as measured by the toe blood pressure index. To summarize what needs to be done in order to properly articulate your proposed research as a PPS&Q with associated aims and objectives, the golden thread should be apparent from the problem statement right through to the objectives. So to look at our example, our problem statement is peripheral arterial disease is common in patients with diabetes mellitus. Screening methods are time-consuming and operator-dependent. With the volume of patients attending the diabetes clinic, identifying PAD with the help of a biomarker will be an advantage. B2M has been identified as a possible marker and needs further investigation in our patient population, who have varying degrees of renal function. Our purpose statement, to move on from that, is the purpose of the study is to determine the diagnostic accuracy of B2M in detecting PAD in patients who have diabetes and renal function impairment. Our research questions would be, how diagnostically accurate is B2M in detecting PAD in patients with diabetes and varying degrees of renal function? Our aim is going to be to investigate the diagnostic accuracy of B2 microglobulin to detect peripheral arterial disease in patients with diabetes mellitus and varying degrees of renal function. And the objective is going to be to establish the diagnostic characteristics of B2M to detect peripheral arterial disease as measured by the toe blood pressure index. So let us come back to the pitfalls to avoid when we are writing up our PPS and Q. First of all, do not write too much. You will lose sight of the bigger picture and get bogged down in details if you write too much. Try to keep everything to 1.5 pages to 2 pages max. Do not write too little. You must paint a clear picture of the research problem to which your research is intended to find a solution. Sometimes the line between the research statement and the aims and objectives is not specific. Make sure there is a clear linear development of the research idea from the statement through to the aims and objectives. There should be no addition of aims and objectives that cannot be clearly read in the research statement. Sometimes the research idea is not measurable. Make sure you can define measurable variables from your research statement and include them in your aims and objectives. Citing non-research objectives, for example, to make doctors aware of diabetes, this is not a good idea. This should be under the heading of potential impact of the project and not under research objectives. Thank you. We have come to the end of this presentation. We can now address some of the questions that you may have.